You're listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
I want to welcome back to the Final Say Radio Show. Again, Morgran Chalfant is with Red Alert Politics, and of course you can go to redalertpolitics.com, where you can find Morgran Chalfant on Twitter. I'm sure she'd appreciate the follow. Welcome back. How are you?
I'm good. How are you? Good to be back.
Oh, it is. Everybody's been on vacation. John and I took off last week. The president took off last 3-4 years. But in all seriousness, the president, I believe, hopefully is back. I hope whatever briefings he didn't get while he was enjoying his time off, that he is being caught up to speed on the hundreds of things that are going on both domestically and around the world, which are threats to our national security and to our friends and neighbors, and even here domestically. And but what you're right there. Have you heard? What's being reported now? What are the first actions going to be? Is the president going to, for example, is he going to address such things as immigration and what's happening in Ferguson? Or is he going to address ISIS and some of the threats possibly in, Syria, the Chinese plane playing Top Gun, showmanships with our plane that happened a few days ago? What's your sense?
Well, I think right now the national conversation is just kind of focused on the ISIS threat in Iraq and Syria. I mean, obviously, while President Obama was on vacation, ISIS released a video showing an ISIS militant beheading American journalist James Foley. And that was something that really bothered people, that President Obama simply gave a statement on this and didn't come back and deal with it. He stayed on vacation playing golf. Actually, notably, he played a golf round right after he gave an address on this tragedy, and he was smiling and fist-bumping his golf partners. So I think that people really are looking towards him now with a critical eye, just looking at what he's going to do next in that situation. As far as Ferguson goes, it's actually pretty interesting because he was away when the turmoil really began and heightened, and he simply gave a few statements on it but didn't really do anything besides send Eric Holder down there. And actually the Missouri governor took matters into his own hands and ordered the National Guard to come help, which helped deal with the situation. So definitely it's calmed down there, so I don't really know if President Obama can or will do anything in terms of Ferguson right now. I think it's really all about figuring out how they're going to build the case and whether or not this cop is going to be indicted.
Well, if you listen, of course, this is John now. If you listen to the words of the president, if you listen to the words of the governor, and if you listen to the words of Eric Holder, it's a foregone conclusion this cop is guilty until proven innocent, which I want to throw an interesting irony into the story isn't this one of the things that should scare people the most about the idea of having the IRS as the enforcement arm of Obamacare? The IRS is one of the few places where you are, in fact, guilty until proven innocent. And I think that's part of the scariest thing here, is that three of the most powerful men in this equation pretty much came right out and said guilty till proven innocent. And by the way, forget all those other facts around the case, like the fact that he wasn't shot in the back, which was the first eyewitness claim, the fact that he just roughed somebody up in a robbery, and the fact that the cop's orbital socket was blown out, which, by the way, might have affected his aim when trying to protect himself. None of these things really matter, do they?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that a lot of those reports have gotten buried underneath the conversation about this outrage in Ferguson. And yes, I mean, there's been extensive reports about how the cop had this violent altercation with Michael Brown beforehand, and Michael Brown's a huge man. I mean, this, obviously, people that know the cop that I've read reports about have claimed that he would only do this in self-defense. But the problem is the way the media, I think, is predominantly covering it is looking at the outrage of the citizens about whether or not this is a race issue, similar to the Trayvon Martin shooting. So I do think it's unfair the way that the governor and Obama and Eric Holder have kind of treated the situation, because we don't know everything that's happened yet. That's the problem. There needs to be a further investigation. There needs to be more evidence. There needs to be a firmer grip on actually what happened before anyone gets demonized. And it's almost too late for that now, because people have come out and just condemned this cop and said, the protesters believe that even if he isn't indicted, that he's, going to pay for whatever he's done. So it is definitely unfair, and it's just so hard to, it's hard to see a full situation so quickly. They really need to build a case before anyone makes these sorts of judgments.
Morgan, I'm curious what kind of feedback and response you've seen in general at Red Alert Politics, because there's two things here that kind of run in parallel. One, of course, is, was this a thug who put the policeman's life in danger and was it justified homicide? The second is this issue that came to the forefront of the militarization, easy for me to say, of our police departments. And sadly, I think those are two completely separate issues, but the way this has been framed, it's almost like you have to pick one side or the other. And I think it's possible that you have two problems here. One is that you did have a thug who maybe we wish he wasn't killed, but nonetheless, if he posed a threat, he was, and maybe he's guilty, but at the same time, maybe the police department also is guilty of being and taking an excessive militaristic view toward their citizens.
Right. Yeah, I think that definitely there are two separate conversations. It's very interesting. Actually, Ron Paul, I thought, did a really good job at addressing the militarization of the police issue. He went on MSNBC last week and spoke about it to Andrea Mitchell and said that, he really actually laid the guilt in the Defense Department, because it is the Defense Department's program that's allowing these weapons to get given to local and state police forces. So, these police forces are only doing their job and trying to protect themselves, but if they're given these gases, these guns, and these tanks, they're going to use them because they're given to them by the Defense Department. So, I think that really it's kind of Congress needs to think about this program or review it further and figure out whether or not it's really necessary, because I think it does sometimes create a culture of violence or a culture of overreacting. But I think that's really is an important issue, and I think some people, especially in the conservative community, have drawn good attention to it, but I do think that issue is getting buried, unfortunately, by the other racial kind of slants of this story, but I do see that coming up quite a bit, and I think that's very interesting too, because I think it's a conversation that our country needs to have, kind of why this Defense Department program is giving these weapons to these smaller police forces.
Yeah, it is very interesting, and I would argue, years ago you'd have cops with their .38 specials going against machine guns. And so they recognized the fact that they had to arm themselves a little heavier to survive. But this is different. This is, in some cases, just regular communities that have, what's the difference between, your average militia and some of these police forces? And you hear the talk about the drones, but I don't want to get too into that. That's like a whole other realm. But I'd love to ask your opinion on this. The president, coming back to work, as we've mentioned, he has a lot of domestic things that have happened that he's been called to task. You have Hillary Clinton there, doing everything she can to rewrite history. I'll call it, my words. Rewrite her history, preparing for her what we view as a run for presidency again in 2016. And, do you think he's going to answer for some of the things that she said or that other people have been saying about his presidency? Or is he just going to focus on the immigration, on some of his agenda items? Because, let's face it, this is going to be a lame duck, but very scary next couple of years, I think.
Yes, I completely agree. As far as Hillary Clinton goes, she did have that interview in The Atlantic a few weeks ago, heavily criticizing President Obama's foreign policy. And actually, I believe the White House issued a statement almost immediately after saying that Hillary Clinton was generally on board with the whole foreign policy idea of the Obama administration. So I think that's his way of kind of firing back. I'm not sure if he's really going to go too much more on the defensive of her comments. And honestly, I hope he doesn't. He's not done himself any service in making himself look strong. He's consistently kind of has a weak position in the world, especially when looked upon by other leaders like Vladimir Putin and like the Syria situation where he backed off on his red line statement. I think that right now the president really just needs to focus on actually doing something that's going to make him look strong, especially in terms of foreign policy. This is an actual threat that's very serious coming out of ISIS, and the fact that he finished off his vacation and smiled and laughed and golfed is really disheartening, I think, to the American people in general. So he really needs to step up and actually do something to deal with these situations. So he does tend to come out on the defensive, I've noticed, especially attacking Congress in his fundraising speeches. But he's always just brushing them off and calling John Boehner's lawsuit against him a stunt and accusing Congress of doing nothing, but he himself is actually doing nothing too. So I think it's really time for the president to actually come back and work instead of accusing other people of not working.
Well, this is how I monitor the situation. I look at the emails I get, titled from people such as Barack Obama and Howard Dean and Debbie Wasserman Schultz that come from all the Democratic organizations. And I monitor all this stuff, and it's crazy. It's like, Brett, you're not going to believe this. The country's going to fall off its axis if we don't give $1 billion to illegal aliens. So, they don't call it that, but, it's just amazing what they're focused on as opposed to what are the significant threats. And I'll say this, tailing on what you just said. When we look at the threats of places such as Syria and wherever these terrorist organizations operate, if we don't respond appropriately, I can guarantee you that Iran is watching, the Russians are watching, the Chinese are watching, the North Koreans are watching, the Venezuelans are watching, the Cubans are watching, and there are more to be named. But we have a lot of people who would love to do us harm, and they are paying attention to how we react.
Absolutely. I completely agree. That's...
Yeah, so while we have you, I don't think there's that much information, and it looks like this isn't anything like Fort Hood or some of the other shooting incidents, but there was an active shooting in Fort Lee in Virginia, and it appears, and I don't know if you have better information, but it appears that a female soldier shot herself.
Yes, that's what I'm hearing. A female soldier apparently barricaded herself in an office this morning around 8:45 and shot herself in the head. And police responded to the situation very quickly when she barricaded herself in this room and established dialogue with her. But yes, she didn't harm anyone else. She only shot herself in the head. She's actually, what I found from the Washington Post today is that she is a sergeant first class with 14 years in the Army. She's been at this base for 3 years and she was deployed in Iraq in 2007 for 15 months. So this is someone that has been in the military for quite some time. There wasn't really a lot of information on her mental state, and there's not really any information on her actual identity, just that she's a female soldier that's been in the military for about 15 years.
Now, this poses a very obvious question that I've never really heard discussed, nor have I seen any evidence one way or another on, but what are the manifestations of women in or near combat? Because remember, if you're serving as a trauma nurse, right, you may never be on the physical front lines, but what you see could be equally as demoralizing and just tear you apart at the soul. So what are the ramifications of women when they're serving in combat and compared to men when you look at post-traumatic stress disorder, and are we effectively monitoring and treating both men and women in frontline and support people who might be, and again, I have no evidence to say that's where it came from, but when you have these single shootings or these these family shootings, very often they are a manifestation of post-traumatic stress. So I didn't know if you heard anything about that. And then I wanted you to comment on that, and I want to throw one more question in before I turn this back to Brett. In Red Alert Politics, you had something on Hillary Clinton being very beatable from a Paul Ryan perspective. So I did want you to touch on both of those issues briefly, if you could.
Absolutely, yes. First, I haven't seen anything yet on that kind of distinction between men and women and the effects of post-traumatic stress. But obviously, this brings up that point. I mean, I think post-traumatic stress has been something that's been focused on as of late, obviously, in the military, and then in sports and professional sports too. So I think it's an issue that needs to be looked into. So that we really understand what our soldiers are going through. And as you mentioned, women, that are serving like that, and seeing these awful tragedies and how they react to them. So I think that's something that does need to be focused on, and maybe this situation will really bring it to light. In terms of Paul Ryan, yes, he was in Tampa recently promoting his book, and he said that he told the Tampa Bay Times that Hillary Clinton is very beatable, particularly because she's essentially would be an Obama third term, that she's going to have trouble distancing herself from President Obama and his policies, which I think is very spot on. She's recently tried to kind of distance herself, for example, in that Atlantic interview, saying that President Obama's foreign policy model of don't do stupid stuff isn't an organizing principle, and then also kind of knocking him for not intervening militarily in Syria. And she's also come out and said in an interview that Obamacare needs to be fixed. But the problem that she has, especially with Obamacare and with foreign policy, is that she stood behind his foreign policy. She was his Secretary of State, and also she had Hillary Care, and she argued for universal health care and supported Obamacare throughout the rollout, even though it was so rocky. So she is going to have a lot of difficulty distancing herself from the president. And it really looks, it's also when she does try to distance herself, as she's doing now, it looks extremely inauthentic because she's kind of going back on her positions and acting like she didn't, do the things and say the things that she did before in support of the president. And I think that American people are going to question that. And I think also American people are very down on President Obama right now, and so they look at Hillary Clinton as, yes, a continuation of him. She would be the first female president. There are other things that people look at her for, but when you really get down to it, she has a lot of the same policy perspectives as he does, and she's supported a lot of the things that he's done despite their failure.
Well, from your lips to God's ears, I really hope you're right. But I also want to say this. Thank God that this incident, the shoot, whatever we want to call it at Fort Lee, thank God there weren't other people involved, because nothing is sadder than watching people anyone for that matter, but especially those who serve us, being struck down in these senseless acts. And so just thank God for once that it's just a personal incident, and they'll be able to deal with this the way it should be. And so that's it. I guess for a bad news story, it's a good news story.
Absolutely.
Yeah. One last thing before we let you go. The Obama administration obviously has to look at and answer the questions of how are they going to respond in the Middle East. And I noticed a story on the AP Wire earlier. I'm not sure if you had a chance to see it because it came out fairly recently. But Damascus, the Syrian government, warned the United States that it shouldn't take any unilateral strikes against the military groups without getting their consent. And when I add that piece of the puzzle along to the cooperation that this administration has with Iran in various things, but especially in Iraq, I think this is scary, and it's a significant shift in foreign policy that we have from moving from being allied with Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Jordan to now being in bed with some of the worst, the mullahs and the Assad. I mean, this is, I think, beyond what our policy should be calling for. This is dangerous ground.
Yes, I completely agree. It's scary, and it's again, as I mentioned before, it would put any president in a difficult situation, but this is a president who has continuously been weak and ineffective in poor foreign policy decisions. So I hope that he listens to people that, actually have foreign policy experience and foreign policy authority that are calling for him to, act strongly. But it's a very tricky situation, and it's going to require strength, but it's also going to require a lot of finesse to figure out exactly how we need to target ISIS and just kind of eradicate it, because this is only a threat that's going to grow if he doesn't deal with it immediately and effectively.
Absolutely. Well, Morgan Chalfant, thank you so much for joining us again. And, of course, you could find her at Red Alert Politics. I'm sorry, what's your Twitter handle? It's
at mchalfant16. So that's at MCHALFANT16.
Excellent. And thank you so much. You're so wonderful. And, you should be on radio, by the way. You have a fantastic voice for it.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate you guys always having me. It's a pleasure.
All right. Take care, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Okay. Bye.